The letter fell from Ira Yates' coat pocket the moment Belle Walker grabbed his arm and spun him around in the middle of the Dusty Creek mercantile, and for one breathless second they both stared at it lying there on the worn plank floor like an accusation neither of them was ready to face. "Pick it up," she said, her voice low and fierce, her dark eyes flashing with something that was equal parts fury and hurt. "Pick it up and read it to me, Ira. Right now. Because your brother just told me what is in that letter, and if half of what Holt said is true, then everything between us has been a lie." Ira did not pick it up. He stood over it the way a man stands over a grave he has dug himself, shoulders tight, jaw locked, the muscle in his cheek jumping like a trapped thing. The mercantile around them went silent. Old Mrs. Pratt behind the counter found something very important to examine on the underside of a bolt of calico. The two ranch hands by the pickle barrel suddenly became fascinated by their own boot tips. "Holt had no right," Ira said, and his voice came out rough, like gravel dragged through a dry creek bed. "Holt had every right," Belle said, stepping closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left brow, the one she had kissed exactly twice and never asked him about. "He is your brother, and I am—" She stopped herself, swallowed hard, recalibrated. "I am the woman you asked to marry you not 3 weeks ago. So if that letter says what Holt says it says, then you owe me the truth. All of it." Ira finally crouched down. His big hand covered the letter completely when he picked it up, and she hated how easily he could make it disappear. He straightened, tucked it back inside his coat with the practiced ease of a man who had hidden this thing 100 times before, and he looked at her with eyes so dark and conflicted she almost faltered. "Almost. Not here," he said. "Then where?" "The river. Tonight I will tell you everything." And she should have said no. She should have walked out of that mercantile and ridden back to her father's claim, and let Ira Yates and his 4 brothers, and his secrets fester in whatever dark hole they had been born in. But she did not. Because she had been in love with Ira Yates since the summer of 1878, when he had ridden onto her father's land in the middle of a drought and fixed the pump that no one else could fix. And some loves, once they take root in dry ground, are harder to kill than anything the West can throw at you. She would be at the river, and they both knew it. The summer of 1878 arrived in the Wyoming Territory like a verdict. Hot, dry, unforgiving. The kind of heat that cracked the earth into patterns that looked like old grief, and made the mountains shimmer at their edges as if even they were uncertain about their own permanence. Belle Walker was 22 years old that summer, which meant she was old enough to know that the world was harder than it looked, and young enough to still be surprised when it proved her right. Her father, Thomas Walker, had claimed 40 acres along the Sweetwater River 3 years prior, which made him one of the more established settlers in the region. Though established in Wyoming Territory in 1878, meant something considerably less comfortable than it might sound. He had a 2-room cabin with a solid roof, a decent well, a kitchen garden that Belle maintained with a stubbornness that bordered on the personal, and a pump that had been failing slowly for 2 months before it finally surrendered entirely on the 3rd day of July. Thomas Walker was a proud man and a practical one. He knew when he was beaten. He rode into Dusty Creek the next morning to inquire at the hardware about parts, and he came back with something he had not expected: a stranger. Ira Yates arrived on a gray horse with 1 white sock, and a bedroll tied behind the saddle with military precision. He was 26, lean in the way men who work with their hands are lean rather than the way men who go hungry are lean, and he had the kind of face that was not immediately handsome, but became impossible to look away from once you started looking. He had dark hair that needed cutting and hands that looked like they knew what they were doing, and he looked at Belle exactly once when Thomas introduced her, and then looked away so quickly and completely that it registered in her chest like a small, precise wound. He fixed the pump in 4 hours. He refused payment. He accepted supper. That was how it began. He rode back the next day to check that the pump was holding. And the day after that he rode back because, as he explained with perfect Western economy, He had been passing this way regardless. Belle served him coffee both times and did not say anything about the fact that the trail between the Yates spread and the nearest town did not pass anywhere near the Walker claim. She was 22 and proud, and she understood the language of men who will not say a direct thing if an indirect one will serve. The Yates brothers were something of a fixture in the Wyoming Territory by 1878. There were 4 of them, plus Ira, which made 5 in total and more than enough to be a story. The oldest was Calhoun, who ran the spread with the kind of authority that had been earned rather than inherited, steady and taciturn and deeply, constitutionally fair. Then came Holt, who was 24 and quick-tempered and handsome in the way that gets men into trouble in saloons. Then the twins, Remington and Ford, who were 20 years old and still conducted themselves with the slightly unnerving synchronicity of people who had shared a womb and never entirely recovered from the experience. And then Ira, the second eldest by 3 years, who had come back from somewhere that the brothers did not discuss, and had slotted himself back into the work of the ranch with a quietness that was not peaceful, but rather the quietness of something under pressure. Belle did not know any of this the summer Ira fixed her pump. She learned it in pieces, the way you learn anything true about a person, slowly and sideways, and usually when they are looking somewhere else. What she knew in July of 1878 was this. Ira Yates had a laugh that happened rarely and landed completely, the way summer rain lands after a long drought. He could fix anything mechanical without being asked and without making a show of it. He read. He had opinions about things he kept mostly to himself unless pressed, and when pressed he was precise and unafraid of being disagreed with. He watched her when he thought she was not watching him, and when he was troubled, which was more often than she would have liked, he went quiet in a way that made the air around him feel dense, like weather. She fell in love with him, the way you fall into a river you have been walking beside for a long time. Not a sudden plunge, but an inevitable one. The moment when the bank gives way beneath your feet and you are simply in it. And the only question left is whether you will swim or sink. He did not tell her he loved her until December, and even then he did it badly, in the middle of a sentence about whether the winter was going to be worse than the last one, suddenly pivoting to say that he thought about her every day, and that he was not good at saying things properly, but that he wanted her to know. She had stared at him. He had stared at the frozen ground. And then she had started laughing, not unkindly but with genuine relief, and he had looked up, and the expression on his face when he saw she was not laughing at him, but with him, the way something collapsed and rebuilt itself in his eyes simultaneously, was the most honest thing she had ever seen on another person's face. He kissed her once that December evening, standing beside her father's corral in the cold, his hands very careful on her face, and then he stepped back and looked at her seriously and said, "I need to tell you some things before this goes any further. Not tonight, but soon." He had not told her. And soon had become weeks, and weeks had become months, and now it was August of 1879, and they had been courting for 8 months, and he had proposed to her 3 weeks ago, and the letter had been burning a hole in his coat pocket since before any of that. And now she was going to stand at the Sweetwater River in the dark and finally hear whatever truth he had been carrying. She arrived at the river first. She always arrived everywhere first because she was constitutionally unable to be late to anything that mattered. The water ran silver and low in the August dark, the sound of it steady and patient, and the cottonwoods along the bank breathed in the slight breeze that came down from the mountains after sundown. Belle stood with her arms crossed, not from coldness but from the need to hold herself steady, and she listened to the horse before she heard it. Ira dismounted without tying the horse. The gray gelding, whose name was Patience for reasons that had become clear over time, simply stood where he was left and cropped at the sparse grass by the bank with the equanimity of a creature who had learned not to expect things. Ira came and stood beside her, not close enough to touch. She noticed. "Start at the beginning," she said, not harshly, but without room for negotiation. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was organizing something internal, and then he said, "You know, I was gone for 2 years before I came back to the ranch. I know you were gone. You have never told me where." "Kansas," he said. "Lawrence, Kansas. I was working for a man named Aldous Pemberton who ran a freight operation. Large enough to have accounts with half the merchants in 3 counties, and crooked enough that most of those accounts were arrangements built on things that would not bear examination." He paused. "I did not know that when I took the job. I figured it out in pieces, same as everything. And when I had figured out enough to be dangerous, Pemberton knew it." Belle turned to look at him. He was looking at the river. "He had a way of keeping men quiet," Ira continued. "Evidence. Real or manufactured, it did not matter much which. He had a letter. My signature on a document that suggested I had been party to a freight fraud that cost a Kansas grain merchant everything he owned. I had signed the document. I had signed it because I was told it was a standard shipping receipt, and I did not read it carefully enough, which was either my stupidity or my trust, and I have spent considerable time deciding which." His voice was flat but controlled. "Pemberton told me what the letter contained. He told me that if I spoke about his operation to anyone, the letter would go to the federal marshal and I would hang for something I did not do. And then he told me to leave Kansas and keep leaving." Belle said nothing. "The river said something. The cottonwoods said something. So I came back to Wyoming. And I told my brothers I had been working freight and it had not suited me and I was done with Kansas and that was the end of it. And I built a life here. A real one. I thought the letter was done. I thought Pemberton was done." He reached into his coat and took out the letter, not unfolding it, just holding it in both hands, looking at it. "Pemberton died last spring. His operation fell apart, and when it fell apart the letter came to me. It was sent by one of his clerks who said he thought I deserved to have it, that he knew it was fabricated and that he was sorry." He looked up at her now, finally. "It arrived 3 months ago. I have been carrying it ever since." "Why?" Belle asked. "Why have you been carrying it instead of burning it?" "Because burning it would not change what it represents, what I came from, what was done to me and what I allowed to be done." His voice changed slightly, lost some of its careful flatness. "And because I did not know how to tell you. Because I have been afraid that if you knew there was a version of my history where Ira Yates had his name on a fraudulent document, even if it was not his choice, that you would look at me differently. And Holt knows all of this." Ira closed his eyes briefly. "Holt found the letter 2 weeks ago. I had left it in my saddlebag and he went looking for a map and he found it instead. He did not ask me about it. He read it. And then he told me." "Yes." Belle was quiet. She was processing the way she always processed, which was thoroughly and without shortcuts. She thought about Ira coming back from Kansas with something heavy and unnamed in his eyes. She thought about the way he had said, "I need to tell you some things," that December evening, and then had not said them, month after month, and now she understood why. She thought about a young man who trusted too easily, who signed a paper because he believed it was what it was told to be, and who had been carrying the weight of that moment of trust for years. "Let me read it," she said. He handed her the letter without hesitation, as if handing it to her was the thing he had been trying to do for 3 months without knowing how. She unfolded it carefully. The moonlight was enough to read by, barely, and she tilted it slightly and read the words that had been imprisoning Ira Yates since Lawrence, Kansas. It was exactly what he had said it was. A freight document, technical and deliberate in its implication, with Ira's signature on the bottom below, language that no ordinary working man would have caught in a casual reading. And below that, in different handwriting, a note from Pemberton's clerk, a man named Samuel Jersh, who wrote in the careful penmanship of a man who had spent his career in a ledger office. The note confirmed everything. The document was fabricated in its framing. The signature was obtained under false pretense. He was sorry. He had carried his own guilt about it for 4 years. Belle folded the letter back along its creases and held it out to Ira. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "It changes nothing," she said. "Nothing that matters." Something broke open in his face that she had not seen before, something behind all the careful control, and for a moment he looked younger than 27, which was actually 27, and exhausted in the way that men who have been holding something alone for too long look when they are finally allowed to put it down. "Belle, you were deceived," she said clearly. "You were held in place by a man who used your own misplaced trust as a weapon. That is not a dark past, Ira. That is a history of injustice, and the only thing you did wrong was carry it like it was your fault." She stepped toward him, close enough now that she had to look up slightly to hold his eyes. "But you should have told me, not for my sake alone, for yours." "I was afraid," he said, and it came out stripped of everything protective, just the truth of it, bare and direct. "I know," she said. "I know you were, and I understand it." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which was the first time she had touched him since the mercantile that afternoon, and she felt the tension in him like a held breath. "But we cannot build a marriage on fear. You have to trust me the way you ask me to trust you." "I trust you more than anyone I have ever known," he said, and the way he said it was not romantic decoration. It was a statement of plain fact delivered by a man who had learned the hard way what trust costs when it is broken. "Then let us burn the letter," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled the letter back out of his pocket, and they walked together to where a small arrangement of stones the ranchers used sometimes as a fire ring sat at the edge of the bank. And Ira produced a match from his vest pocket with the practicality of a man who always had what was needed. He lit the edge of the letter and they both watched it burn, the old paper catching cleanly and quickly, the orange light of it brief and bright against the dark river. When the last ember died on the stones, Ira turned to her and took both of her hands in his and held them with a steadiness that had nothing shaky in it anymore, the steadiness of a man who had just set down a very heavy thing and found he could still stand upright. "I am sorry," he said, "for not telling you sooner. For letting Holt get there first, for making you feel like I was hiding something from you rather than from myself." "You are forgiven," she said, simply and completely, the way she did things. "But Ira, your brothers, do they all know?" He shook his head. "Only Holt now. Calhoun does not know the details. The twins know nothing." "Are you going to tell them?" He considered this seriously, which she appreciated. He did not dismiss the question or give her a quick, easy answer. "Calhoun," he said finally. "I need to tell Calhoun. He is the oldest. He has been running the ranch with assumptions about me that are not entirely complete, and he deserves the whole picture." The twins, he thought about Remington and Ford, who were 21 now and still more entangled with each other than with anyone else. "The twins do not need to know the specifics. They need to know that I was in a difficult situation in Kansas and that it is resolved. That is enough. And Holt," a shadow crossed his face, "Holt and I are going to have words about the fact that he went to you before he came to me." Belle felt something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Do not be too hard on him. I think he was trying to protect me." "He was trying to protect you from me," Ira said, and there was no heat in it, just a flat accuracy. "Which tells me something about what Holt thinks of my choices, and that is a conversation we are going to have regardless." She squeezed his hands. "Ira, look at me. He did. I chose you. 3 weeks ago I said yes to the question you asked me, and I am still saying yes. The letter has nothing to do with that." He looked at her in the moonlight by the Sweetwater River with the ashes of the letter cooling at their feet, and the night around them warm and dark and full of crickets and distant coyotes, and the expression on his face was one she filed away in the part of her mind she kept for things she knew she would want to remember when she was old. "I do not deserve you," he said. "That," she said, "is an argument we are going to be having for the next 50 years, so you had better practice now." This time his smile arrived fully, the rare one, the one that changed his whole face, and he pulled her closer and she went, and when he kissed her it was different from the careful December kiss by the corral. It was the kiss of a man who has just been absolved of something and cannot yet entirely believe it, and is holding the evidence of it in his hands. Dusty Creek in the fall of 1879 was a town of approximately 400 people. which made it sizable enough to have two churches, and small enough that both churches knew everyone's business in specific and occasionally competitive detail. The wedding of Ira Yates and Belle Walker was the kind of event that a town of 400 treats as a community experience regardless of whether they were invited, which they mostly were, because Thomas Walker believed in feeding people, and the Yates brothers between them knew nearly everyone in a 60-mile radius. The week before the wedding was the week Ira told Calhoun. He had been putting it off. Not from fear of Calhoun's judgment exactly, but from something more complicated, the way it feels to revise a story that someone has been operating by for years. Calhoun had believed Ira's version of his 2 years in Kansas, the simple one, the one where it was just freight work that did not suit him. Taking that away and replacing it with the truth felt like a disruption of something structural. Calhoun listened to all of it without interrupting, sitting on the porch of the main house in the low autumn sun with his coffee going cold in his hands. When Ira finished, Calhoun was quiet for a time that would have been uncomfortable with anyone else but was, with Calhoun, simply how he operated. "You should have told me," Calhoun said finally. "I know. Not because I would have judged you, because I would not have. But because you carried something alone that you did not have to carry alone, and that is a waste of what a family is for." Ira absorbed this. "You sound like Belle." "Belle sounds like good sense," Calhoun said, and something that was almost a smile moved across his face before it settled back into its customary gravity. "You are a lucky man, Ira. I am aware. Pemberton is dead and the letter is burned and there is nothing left of it but the memory, and the memory does not define you unless you let it." Calhoun picked up his coffee, seemed to realize it was cold, and set it back down. "I am glad you told me, and I am glad you found a woman worth telling." Holt was harder. Not because Holt was harder in himself, exactly, but because the conversation had to happen between brothers, and that meant it had layers that a conversation with Calhoun, with all his steady authority, did not have. Calhoun was the oldest, and that put him in a category adjacent to law. Holt was only 2 years younger than Ira, and they had grown up in the particular intimacy of siblings close in age, which meant they knew how to wound each other efficiently. Ira found him in the barn and did not ease into it. "You went to Belle before you came to me," Ira said. Holt looked up from the saddle he was working on and did not look away. Whatever else Holt was, he was not a man who retreated from the things he had done. "I did." "Why?" "Because she needed to know." "That is not your decision to make. Someone had to make it." Holt set the saddle oil down. "You had that letter for 3 months, Ira, 3 months, and you were going to marry that woman without ever telling her what was in it. How is that fair to her? It was my decision to make and my time to choose." "You were not choosing," Holt said, and now his voice had the edge that it got when he was not just arguing but saying something he had thought through. "You were avoiding. There is a difference, and Belle deserves better than a husband who avoids hard truths." Ira was quiet for a moment, controlling the initial hot response that rose in him, which he knew was partly anger and partly the specific discomfort of being told something that is true. "She deserves better than to hear them from someone who is not me." Holt looked at him. "Does she have them now, from you?" A pause. "Yes." "Then it worked out." "That is not the point." "It is exactly the point," but Holt's voice had come down slightly. "I am sorry I went to her first. I should have come to you. But I was not going to stay silent while my brother walked into a marriage with a secret that size. And if you are going to be angry with me about that, then you can be angry. But I am not going to tell you I was wrong to care about what happened to Belle Walker." There was a long silence in the barn. A horse shifted in one of the stalls. Somewhere outside Remington or Ford was hammering something with cheerful inconsistency. "She is going to be my wife," Ira said finally, "which makes her your sister, you understand that?" Something shifted in Holt's expression. "I understand that." "Then we are finished with this." Holt nodded. "We are finished with this." It was not an embrace, and it was not a formal reconciliation. It was two brothers in a barn who understood each other well enough to know that some things got said and then got closed, and then the business of being brothers continued, which is its own kind of fidelity. The wedding was on the 14th of October, 1879. The cottonwoods along the Sweetwater had gone gold, and the sky was the specific deep blue that Wyoming does in October that looks almost too blue to be real. And Belle Walker stood outside the church in her best dress, which was green wool with ivory buttons and had been let out at the sleeves to be slightly more formal, and she was the most beautiful thing Ira Yates had ever seen in his life. He told her so, quietly, as she came to stand beside him at the front of the church, which was not traditional but which was entirely them, and she looked at him with those dark eyes that could read him like a map and said, "You clean up reasonably well yourself, Yates." Reverend Mac Hollies officiated with the kind of warm efficiency that a frontier preacher develops over years of weddings that need to be held between weather events. The four brothers sat in the front row on the groom's side, Calhoun with his arms folded and his face serious and something genuinely moved in his eyes, Holt watching with an expression that was complicated and sincere and probably as close to an apology as it was going to get in a public setting, and the twins Remington and Ford, who were sitting slightly too close together as always and who both cried without any apparent awareness that they were doing so. Thomas Walker gave his daughter away with the contained emotion of a man who had been a widower for 6 years, and who had raised this girl alone through drought and hard winters and the particular loneliness of frontier life, and who was now watching her take the hand of a man he had come, over 14 months, to trust entirely. When Reverend Holly said the words and Ira and Belle looked at each other and spoke their vows, the small church was absolutely silent in the way that spaces go silent when something true is happening in them. Ira said his vows in a steady voice that did not waver, looking at Belle with the undivided attention of a man who has decided. Belle said hers with a quiet precision that gave each word its full weight. The reception was held at the Walker claim because it was larger and because Belle had insisted, and the whole of Dusty Creek came, as was expected, and brought food and music and opinions about everything. The twins danced with everyone who would have them and several who initially declined. Holt drank somewhat more than was strictly advisable and was steered toward coffee by Calhoun with the practiced ease of long habit. Thomas Walker sat with the older men of the settlement and accepted their congratulations with a dignity that only cracked once, briefly, when Mrs. Pratt from the Mercantile told him his daughter was the finest young woman in the territory, and he had to look at the mountains for a moment before he could agree. Ira danced with Belle exactly 3 times, which for a man who danced with the enthusiasm of someone solving a problem he had not encountered before was actually a significant investment. On the third dance, slower, later in the evening when the fire was low and the crowd had thinned to the dedicated, he held her close enough that her head was near his shoulder and he said quietly into her hair, "I meant what I said in there." "Which part?" she said, equally quiet. "All of it, every word." A pause. "But especially the part about keeping only to you. I want you to know that I understand what I am asking of you in a place like this, in a life like this, and I intend to make it worth asking." She pulled back slightly to look at him. "I know you do," she said. "That is why I said yes." The first winter of their marriage was a hard one, which was not unusual for Wyoming and not unexpected, but it had a quality that the early winters of a first marriage have, the quality of discovering how another person actually lives when there is no performance of courtship left to maintain. What Belle discovered was that Ira was a better partner than he had been a suitor, which was saying something, because he had been a very attentive suitor. He did not retreat into himself in the way she had half feared, the way some men did when the bright surface of courtship gave way to the actual material of daily life. He showed up. Fully, consistently, in the practical ways that matter more in a frontier marriage than any amount of sentiment. He kept the fire. He minded the stock in bad weather without complaint. He fixed things before they asked to be fixed, and he talked to her, actually talked, In the evenings when the work was done and the snow was falling outside and the cabin was warm with lantern light, he told her more about Kansas. Not all at once, but in pieces over those winter evenings, filling in the history that had been sealed behind the letter. He told her about the freight operation, about the man Pemberton who had been charming and specific and systematically criminal, about the other men who had worked there, some of whom had known and been complicit, and some of whom, like Ira, had been caught in it without consent. He told her about the day he realized what he was part of, and the days after that when he had lived with the knowledge of his own signature on that document and the powerlessness of it. Belle listened to all of it the way she did everything, thoroughly and without shortcuts, and sometimes she asked questions and sometimes she was simply present with it, and Ira understood both as what they were: a woman receiving the whole of a person's history and deciding what to do with it. What she did with it was integrate it. She filed it alongside everything else she knew about him, and it did not change the orientation, only added detail, the way adding more brush to a drawing deepens it without altering the essential shape. In February of 1880, she told him she was expecting their first child, sitting across the table from him at breakfast with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, and her expression carefully neutral in a way that told him she was nervous, which she almost never was. The expression on Ira's face as it processed this information was one that Belle later described to her friend and neighbor, a woman named Agnes Colton who had homesteaded the adjacent claim, as looking like a man who had just been told that something he had been hoping for but had not let himself want had arrived after all. He sat very still for a moment and then he looked up at her with eyes that were entirely unguarded, no careful control anywhere in them, and said, "Are you well?" It was such a perfectly Ira response, his first question being about her rather than anything else, that she smiled and said, "I am very well. How are you?" He got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched beside her and took her hands out of her coffee cup and held them, and he did not say anything for a moment because he was one of those people for whom the very large things produce silence rather than speech. "Good," he said finally. "That is very good, Belle." "I thought you might think so," she said, and when he laughed she reached out and touched his face, and they stayed like that for a while in the February kitchen with the cold outside and everything warm and possible between them. The spring of 1880 brought with it something that complicated the general happiness of the Yates household considerably: Holt's drinking. It had been a problem in a minor key before, the kind of thing the family managed with careful attention and Calhoun's steady redirections. But the winter had been difficult on the ranch. They had lost several head of cattle to cold and illness, and Holt had taken it personally in the way he took everything, which was with a frontal intensity that had nowhere to go when the problem was weather and luck and the fundamental indifference of nature. He had been drinking more since December. By March it was daily. By April Calhoun had spoken to him twice, and Ira had spoken to him once, and nothing had changed. The specific incident that brought it to a head was a Tuesday morning in April when Holt, who had been drinking since the previous evening, picked a fight with a man in town named Davis Creel, a large and not patient man who worked at the sawmill, and the fight had ended with Holt in the dust of the main street, and a cracked rib and a black eye, and a kind of shame that the Walker family witnessed from across the street, because Belle had been at the mercantile and Ira had come to meet her. Ira helped Holt up from the dust without saying a word. He put Holt on his horse. He told Belle he would see her that evening. He rode Holt back to the ranch himself and put him to bed and sat in a chair by the window of Holt's room while Holt slept and thought about what it means to love someone whose darkness is different from your own darkness. When Holt woke in the afternoon and became aware of Ira sitting there, something crossed his face that was close to shame and possibly close to relief. "Go ahead," Holt said. His voice was rough. "I am not going to say anything you have not already said to yourself," Ira said. "I am going to say one thing, Holt, and then I am going to leave the room and I am not going to bring it up again unless you want me to." Holt waited. "You came to Belle because you thought I was destroying something with my silence," Ira said. "You were not wrong, but the drinking is a silence of your own and it is destroying something too. What that thing is I do not know for certain, but you do." He stood up. "You are my brother, I am here, that is all." He left the room. What Holt's drinking was a silence about took another few weeks to come out, and it came out not to Ira but to Calhoun, and Calhoun told Ira carefully and with Holt's permission. Holt had been in love with a woman in town named Ira Yates, a dark-eyed, quiet woman who sewed for several of the settler families, and had come from New Mexico with her widowed mother 2 years prior. He had been in love with her for most of those 2 years, and had done nothing about it, partly from his own uncertainty, and partly from a stubborn notion he had developed that she deserved better than what a cowboy with a quick temper could offer. And last winter Ira Yates had married a man named Peters who was an accountant from back east with steady prospects and smooth hands, and Holt had decided to drink about it rather than feel it, which was a very Holt solution to a very Holt problem. What happened next was, in Ira's private opinion, one of the more remarkable pieces of family management he had ever observed. Calhoun, having received this information, sat with it for 3 days and then went to Ira Yates Peters and told her, with the straightforward dignity that was Calhoun's entire personality, that his brother had cared for her and lost his chance to say so and was struggling, and that he was not asking her to do anything about it, but that he thought she should know, because it seemed relevant to the kind of person she was to know that she was valued in that way. And Ira Yates Peters, who was married and intended to stay that way, and who was in fact quite happy with Mr. Peters and his steady prospects, said she was sorry for Holt's pain, and that she would pray for him, and that she hoped he would be all right. And somehow, knowing that she had been told, knowing that it was real rather than a wound he was nursing in private, helped Holt in a way that logic could not quite explain, but that made sense in the complicated accounting of the heart. He was not cured of anything. He still drank more than he should. But the particular desperate edge of it began to ease, and he began to talk more to the brothers, to anyone. And gradually, over the spring and into the summer, he became more himself. Belle watched all of this from her adjacent vantage point as a Walker who had married into the Yates family, and she thought about the ways that men carry pain without telling anyone, and the ways that women do the same, and the ways that the particular culture of the West made both of those tendencies worse by rewarding silence and stoicism and the appearance of not needing anything. She thought about her own father, silent in his grief for 6 years. She thought about Ira, carrying his letter. She thought about Holt, drinking his love into the ground. And she thought about herself, because she was honest enough for that, about the things she kept quiet out of pride, and the ways she sometimes solved problems alone when she could have asked for help, which was its own version of the same darkness. She was thinking about this on a July evening in 1880, large with pregnancy and sitting on the porch in the golden light with a glass of cold water, and a book she was only pretending to read, when Ira came and sat beside her with the ease of a man entirely comfortable with where he was. "You are thinking very loudly," he said. "I am thinking about silence," she said. "Whose?" "Everyone's." She looked at him. "Ira, I want to ask you something." "Ask." "When you kept the letter, when you were carrying it all those months, were you afraid that I would leave if I knew?" He considered this the way he considered things, without rushing. "Yes," he said, "partly, but it was more than that. I was afraid." He stopped, tried again. "I had built something here, in Wyoming, in my family, in the ranch in who I was in this place." And the letter was from a version of events that felt like it belonged to a different Ira Yates, one who had been careless and who had been made powerless, and I did not want to introduce that person into this life. I did not want you to know him. "But he is part of you," Belle said. "The man who trusted too easily and got hurt for it. The man who was held silent for years. That is not someone I would leave. That is someone I would." She stopped, touched her own face, recalibrated. "That is someone I love as much as every other part of you. Because those are the parts that made you careful with me. That made you think before you spoke. That made you understand what it feels like to be trapped by something you cannot explain. Ira was looking at her with that undivided attention again. I am trying to tell you, she said, that you do not need to protect me from your history. I chose your history when I chose you. All of it. The good parts and the complicated parts and the parts that are still, she smiled slightly, still being worked out by your brothers in various dramatic fashions. He almost smiled. You are referring to Holt. I am always referring to Holt. She reached over and took his hand, which rested on the arm of the chair between them, and laced her fingers through his. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when you are carrying something from now on, something heavy or dark or complicated, that you will tell me before it gets to the point of letters and mercantile confrontations and midnight meetings at Rivers. He tightened his hand around hers. I promise you, he said, with the same weight and precision he had given his wedding vows. Although I cannot promise the absence of Rivers, I like Rivers. I like Rivers too, she said. I just prefer to visit them recreationally. He did smile then, the full one, and she leaned against his shoulder in the July evening with the light going gold across the Wyoming hills. And they sat together in the comfortable quiet of two people who have moved through something real and arrived somewhere better than where they started. Their son was born on the 23rd of August, 1880, in the middle of a thunderstorm that rattled the windows of the new bedroom they had added to the cabin in the spring. Agnes Colton attended the birth along with the local midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Dundee, who had been delivering babies in the Wyoming Territory for 15 years, and who had an air of absolute unflappability that Belle found deeply reassuring at approximately 2 in the morning, when everything was at its most demanding. Ira was in the main room, which was where husbands went in 1880 because that was where they were put, and he was not the kind of man to make other people's moments about himself. He sat by the fire and listened to the thunder and drank coffee, and did not sleep, and occasionally got up and stood very close to the bedroom door without quite touching it. At 3:15 in the morning, Mrs. Dundee opened the door and said that he could come in now, and he went in with the careful movement of a man who is trying to be quiet in a loud place. Belle was exhausted and luminous in the way new mothers are, stripped of every surface thing, entirely honest in her face, and she was holding a small bundle that was already making its opinions on the world audible. She looked up at Ira when he came in, and the look they exchanged was one of those wordless communications between people who have learned each other's language, a whole conversation in the space of a glance. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms with the instinct of a woman who trusts the person she is handing something irreplaceable to. And Ira held his son for the first time with the extremely careful, extremely serious expression of a man who is holding something he did not know it was possible to want this much. He is healthy, Mrs. Dundee said from the doorway, with the satisfaction of someone reporting a successful conclusion to a complex project. He is, Belle said, watching Ira watch the baby. What will you call him? Agnes asked from the chair in the corner where she had been trying to appear helpful. Belle and Ira had discussed this. They had discussed it in the careful, thorough way they discussed everything, going through family names and working names and names that felt right against the specific child they were imagining. They had disagreed about 2 of the options and agreed about 1. Thomas, Belle said. Thomas Ira Yates, her father's name. His name. Both. Ira did not look up from the baby. Thomas, he said quietly, trying the name against the small reality of the person in his arms, and it settled into place with the ease of something correct. The 4 brothers came to see Thomas the following Sunday, which was the soonest they could all be gathered, and the experience of watching 4 large Western men interact with a newborn was one that Belle privately found one of the more entertaining things she had witnessed. Calhoun held him with the same careful authority he applied to everything, and declared him a sound child in a tone that suggested he had been assessing calves, and found this one satisfactory. The twins held him simultaneously for approximately 45 seconds before Mrs. Dundee, who had stayed on for the week, removed him from the situation. Holt held him last, standing slightly apart from the others, and the look on his face when the baby wrapped a small fist around his index finger was one that Belle noted and filed away, because it told her something about Holt's future that Holt himself had not yet worked out. Holt, as it happened, fell in love again the following spring, and this time he did not stay quiet about it. The woman's name was Edith Cross, and she had come to Dusty Creek in March of 1881 with her brother, who was establishing a hardware supply. She was 25, red-haired, forthright, and entirely unbothered by Holt's quick temper because she had one of her own, and they recognized each other's immediately the way people with the same frequency do, either repelling violently or locking in. They locked in. Holt told her he was interested in her on their second meeting, which was several days faster than any of his brothers had managed anything similar, and Edith Cross said that she had wondered what was taking him so long, which was the response that confirmed for Holt that this was entirely different from Clara Ray's and always had been. He proposed in December of 1881. She accepted. They were married in February of 1882 and were, collectively, the loudest couple in the Wyoming Territory, and entirely devoted to each other in the specific way of people who would rather fight than be bored and would rather be challenged than comfortable. Belle liked Edith enormously. They became friends with the speed and ease of women who recognize in each other a compatible level of honesty, and the friendship was good for both of them. The working through of the particular challenges of frontier life with a companion who could be counted on for both practical advice and frank opinion. In the summer of 1882, two things happened in close succession that changed the shape of the Yates family considerably. The first was that Calhoun Yates, at 35 and after years of running the ranch with dedicated bachelorhood as his permanent condition, met a widow named Margaret Foss who had come from Montana with her 10-year-old son, and a claim of her own adjacent to the Yates spread, and within 6 months had married her with the same quiet decisiveness he brought to everything else, which surprised no one who knew him and surprised him most of all. The second was a letter from a man in Kansas. Not the letter. A different letter. This one was from a Kansas circuit judge named Elias Wharton, who had been investigating the collapsed Pemberton freight operation and had found, in the business records that were being examined in the subsequent legal proceedings, a number of documents that had Ira's name on them, and who was writing to determine whether Ira Yates was the same Ira Yates of Dusty Creek, Wyoming Territory, who had been identified in a clerk's testimony as someone who had been defrauded by Pemberton rather than complicit with him. Ira read this letter alone early in the morning before Belle was up, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold, and by the time she came downstairs he had read it 3 times. He handed it to her without preamble. She read it, read it again, looked up at him. "They want you to testify," she said. It was not a question. "They want to confirm who I am and what my involvement was," he said. The clerk, he testified. He told them about the fabricated document. "They are building a case against 2 of Pemberton's associates who are still living, and they need to verify the history of what happened to the men who were used." "You will go," Belle said. He had not said he would. She had not asked him. It was simply the right thing and they both knew it. "I will go," he agreed. "I want to go with you. Belle." He said her name in the tone that meant he was about to be protective in a way she was about to decline. "Thomas is 2 years old and Calhoun's Margaret has already offered to help with him if we are ever away," she said efficiently. "This is your history and I want to stand in it with you. Kansas is not a foreign country. It is a 2-day train ride." She looked at him across the table. "You are not carrying this alone, not anymore." He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the window behind her, and she was in her work dress with her dark hair not yet pinned, and she was 26 years old and the most constant thing in his life, the point from which everything else was measured. "Not alone," he agreed. They went to Lawrence, Kansas in September of 1882 on the new railroad that had reached Cheyenne the previous year, taking the Union Pacific east and then connecting south. And it was the first real journey of their marriage, and it had a quality that felt significant: the crossing of distance together, the unfamiliar landscape outside the train window that neither of them commented on too much because there was enough to think about. The courthouse in Lawrence was large and formal and smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the judge was a thin, precise man who looked at Ira with the particular attention of someone who has been reading about a person and is now verifying the reality against the record. Samuel Jersh was there. He was a small man in his 40s, with the careful manner of someone who had spent years being careful about the wrong things and was now trying to apply that care more honestly. He and Ira shook hands with the slightly excessive formality of men who have been linked by circumstance rather than choice and do not quite know what to make of each other. "You wrote a letter," Ira said. "I did," Jersh said. "I should have written it sooner." "Yes," Ira said, "and then because he was who he was, but you wrote it, that counts for something." The testimony took 3 hours across 2 sessions and was factual and complete, and Ira delivered it with the same quiet precision he brought to everything difficult. And Belle sat in the gallery and watched her husband face the specific history he had spent years avoiding and found that facing it clearly, in a courthouse with windows and a judge and a record being kept, diminished it considerably. Not eliminated it, diminished it. Brought it down to its proper size, which was: a bad thing had happened to a young man who trusted wrongly and was punished for it, and now the record would reflect that, and it was done. The judge thanked him formally. Jersh thanked him with more feeling than formality, and as they left the courthouse and walked into the Lawrence afternoon, Belle took Ira's hand and he held on to it with an ease that he had not quite managed on the way in. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Like something is finished," he said. "It is," she said. They spent 2 more days in Lawrence because the train schedule made it practical, and those 2 days were unexpectedly good. They ate at a restaurant. They went to a performance at a small theater on the main street that was not great theater, but was lively and had good jokes. They walked along the river that ran through the town, a different river from the Sweetwater, wider and slower, and Ira told her the parts of his Kansas story that were not dark, the parts he had not told before because the weight of the letter had made everything from that period feel heavy. He told her about a horse he had liked that belonged to one of the other freight men. He told her about a woman who ran a boarding house who made the best apple pie he had ever eaten until he ate Belle's, which he said with the exact right timing, so that it landed as the sincere compliment it was. He told her about a friendship he had briefly had with another young man from the operation who had moved to Colorado afterward, and he wondered aloud what had become of that man, with the slightly wistful quality of someone remembering something that had been good before it was complicated. Belle listened and walked beside him, and thought that this was what healing actually looked like when it was real rather than performed. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden lightness, but this: the ability to walk through a place that had cost you something and find the things that were simply part of life among the things that had been hard. The ability to recover the full texture of experience rather than flattening it all to darkness. On the train back to Wyoming, she leaned against him in the way that had become entirely natural over 3 years of marriage, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the plains give way to the elevations of Wyoming in the fading afternoon, and she thought that she was very glad to be going home. Home in 1883 meant more than it had in 1879. It meant the expanded cabin with its new rooms, built over 2 springs with the help of the brothers in the particular communal labor of frontier families who do not hire what they can do themselves. It meant the kitchen garden that Belle had expanded year by year until it was producing enough surplus to trade at the mercantile. It meant Thomas, who was 3 now and had Ira's dark eyes and Belle's stubbornness in exact equal measure, which was a combination that the household was learning to negotiate with considerable creativity. It meant the Yates brothers in all their variousness, Calhoun and Margaret settling into their combined household with the seriousness of two capable people constructing something solid together. Holt and Edith and their extraordinary domestic volume, which had recently increased by the addition of a daughter named Clara, a naming choice that Ira had thought about carefully and decided was its own kind of healed thing. The twins, Remington and Ford, still at the main ranch, still slightly uncanny in their synchrony but developing, slowly, their individual lives. Remington had started keeping company with a girl from the Colton family, Agnes Colton's niece, who had come to help on the claim. Ford had discovered that he had a talent for horses that went beyond ordinary cowboy competence into something that was close to art, the ability to read what an animal was feeling and respond to it with a precision that was specific and striking. And it meant the Sweetwater River, which ran its course through all of it, through all the seasons and all the years, with the patient indifference of rivers that have been there longer than any of the stories told along their banks. Belle found out she was expecting their second child in October of 1883. She told Ira over breakfast again, because mornings at the table had become the place for important disclosures in their household, which said something about the quality of their mornings. Ira received this information with the same process as the first time, that brief stillness, followed by an expression of undisguised happiness, followed by practical concern for her well-being. He had not changed in this. She did not want him to. "I would like a girl this time," she said. "Thomas will have opinions about this," Ira said. "Thomas is 3. Thomas can adapt. Thomas does not adapt. Thomas negotiates and then does whatever he intended from the beginning." Belle considered this accurate assessment of their son's personality. "He gets that from you. He absolutely does not get that from me. The stubbornness perhaps not," she allowed. "The strategic patience absolutely." Ira thought about this for a moment with the expression of a man who wants to object but cannot find a legitimate opening. "I will allow that," he said finally, and she laughed. Their second child was a girl, born in July of 1884, which was gratifying to Belle's stated preference, and to Thomas who, after an initial period of assessment, decided his sister was acceptable and took a proprietary interest in her that was equal parts sweet and bossily Yates. They named her Alina Rose Yates, called Ellie from her first week, and she had Belle's stubborn chin and Ira's dark hair, and an early personality that suggested she was going to be a person of strong views clearly expressed, which in the Yates family was rather on brand. The summer of Ellie's birth was also the summer that Remington Yates married Agnes Colton's niece, whose name was Lucy, and who was 22 and kind and sensible, and made Remington measurably more of all three, which the family received with collective relief. Ford remained unmarried and showed no signs of urgency about it, which Ford took as the freedom to be Ford, and which the brothers took as the ongoing puzzle of Ford, who was clearly fine, but in ways they could not entirely map. Thomas Walker, Belle's father, came to visit that August for 3 weeks, which was the longest visit he had made since the wedding, and he spent most of it playing with Thomas and Ellie, and sitting on the porch in the evenings talking with Ira in the slow, easy way of two men who have been measuring each other for years and have arrived at a mutual satisfaction. On the last evening of his visit, Belle came out and found them both sitting in companionable silence watching the sun go down behind the hills, and she stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the two of them, this man who had raised her alone and this man who had chosen her deliberately, and felt something that was too full to be named with any single word. "You are staring," her father said, without turning around. "I am looking," she said. "There is a difference." "That is what your mother used to say," he said, and this was sufficiently rare, a direct reference to her mother, that it landed with weight. He turned then and looked at her with the particular look he had for moments when the grief and the gratitude were operating simultaneously. "She would have liked this," he said. "What you have built here." Belle came out and sat on the step below them and leaned against the porch rail and looked at the same sunset. "I hope so," she said. "I know so," he said, with the certainty of a man speaking of someone he knew better than anyone else and had been authorized by years of knowledge to speak for. Ira said nothing, but his hand found Belle's where it rested on the rail, and he held it quietly until the sun was entirely down and the first stars came out over Wyoming. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because years never are, but they were the good kind of difficult, the difficulty that comes from building something real rather than from hiding something real. The ranch grew. Thomas grew, which was its own ongoing adventure. A boy who at 7 had opinions about cattle management, and at 8 had taught himself to read a surveying tool by studying Ford's instruments without permission, and at 9 had decided that he wanted to learn everything. Which was the kind of ambition that could go in several directions, and which Ira and Belle discussed with the careful, engaged attention of parents, who understand that their job is not to shape a child into a predetermined form, but to help them find their own. Ellie at 4 was a force of nature in miniature, a small, determined person who had taken Remington's horse, a very patient mare, on an unauthorized solo visit at age 3, and had been found 2 fields over trying to open a gate that she was not yet tall enough to manage. This event was simultaneously terrifying and, once the terror passed, deeply characteristic, and Ira had sat with her afterward and explained very calmly and specifically why this had been dangerous, and Ellie had listened with the attentive, serious expression she had for things she was actually interested in, and then had said, "But I nearly had the gate," which was both completely missing the point and also accurate. Belle had to leave the room briefly at this juncture. She came back composed. Holt's daughter Clara was growing up in the particular magnificent way of children with 2 fierce and loving parents, opinionated and creative and deeply attached to both of them. Holt himself was the version of himself that he had been working toward since before he knew he was working toward it. Still quick, still intense, but with purpose under the intensity now. Edith's steady partnership giving the energy somewhere to go that was constructive rather than destructive. He had largely stopped the drinking. Not entirely. One did not wave a hand at that kind of habit and have it simply disappear, but mostly, with occasional backslides that he was honest about rather than hiding, which was the part that mattered. Ford, in the spring of 1886, did find love. It arrived in the form of a woman named June, who came through the territory with a cattle drive from Texas, and who was among the small number of women working those drives in that period, and who rode better than anyone Ford had seen, and was entirely unimpressed by the Yates brothers collectively, which was apparently what was required to interest Ford Yates specifically. She stayed. They married in June of 1887, which the family took as a cosmically appropriate scheduling choice. By the spring of 1888, the Yates family had expanded to a degree that would have been unimaginable to the 5 brothers who had arrived in Wyoming Territory with a stake and a plan and various forms of personal chaos. The main ranch hosted Calhoun and Margaret and her son, who was now 18, and had become, over 6 years, genuinely and deeply a Yates in everything but blood. Holt and Edith's claim adjoined the main property to the east, with Clara and a second child now, a boy they had named after their father. Remington and Lucy held the northeast quarter of the family land with their 2-year-old daughter. Ford and June ran horses on the southern section, with a focused intensity that was producing results that were getting noticed beyond Dusty Creek. And Ira and Belle's claim, which had started as Belle's father's 40 acres and grown through the years with careful acquisition, sat along the Sweetwater with the expanded cabin and the garden and the outbuildings, and on most evenings, a quality of life that was not wealthy in the material sense of the word, but was rich in every sense that mattered. Thomas Walker, Belle's father, had moved in with them the previous winter. He was 63 and his health was not what it had been, and Belle had asked him and he had resisted, and she had asked him again in the specific way that meant she was asking once more, and then doing it regardless of the answer. And he had arrived with his single trunk of belongings and his opinions and his tobacco pipe, which he was not allowed to smoke inside, and he had settled into the household with a rightness that surprised even him. He played chess with Ira in the evenings with a fierce competitive commitment that had revealed an entirely new dimension of Ira's personality, which was that he was a ruthless chess player who had been waiting for a worthy opponent. Thomas and Ira played chess most evenings while Belle read or sewed, or, increasingly as Ellie got older, had long conversations with her daughter about the considerable topics that interested Ellie. Thomas was teaching Thomas Jr., which was how the child had been designated in the household to avoid confusion, the finer points of the game, and Thomas Jr. was showing an aptitude that delighted his grandfather and concerned everyone who played against him. Belle was 32 in 1888, which in her own reckoning meant she was in the middle of her life, the part where you have enough behind you to measure what is in front of you with some accuracy. She knew what she had. She had worked for it and chosen it and defended it and built it with her own hands alongside the man she had chosen. And she thought about this sometimes with the particular clarity of a woman who knows herself well enough to be precise about what she values. She thought about the letter that had been burning in a fire ring on the Sweetwater River 9 years ago. About the version of this life that would not have happened if she had walked out of the mercantile in August of 1879 and not gone to the river. She could feel the edges of that other life the way you can feel a gap where a tooth used to be, the exact shape of the missing thing. She thought about the specific sequence of events, Holt reading the letter, Holt going to her, her confronting Ira in the mercantile, the letter falling to the floor, and the strange gratitude she felt now for all of it. For Holt's imperfect and well-meaning intervention. For her own refusal to accept silence as an answer. For Ira's decision, finally, on the bank of the river, to put down the thing he had been carrying and reach for what was actually in front of him. She thought about the ways that love in real life is not the thing the stories tell you it is, the clean, bright event, the declaration in the rain, the kiss at the end with nothing left to be worked out. Real love, she had concluded, was more like the pump that Ira had fixed in the summer of 1878. Functional, necessary, in need of regular maintenance, worth the effort to keep running, entirely unglamorous when examined from certain angles, and the difference between thriving and not in a dry summer. She thought this one evening in August of 1888. Sitting on the porch in the last of the light with Ellie asleep inside, and Thomas Jr. having been delivered back from the main ranch, where he had spent the afternoon with Calhoun doing something agricultural that he would describe in extensive detail later, and her father napping in the chair by the window, and Ira coming across the yard from the barn with his coat off, and his sleeves rolled up, and the particular walk of a man done with the day's work. He saw her watching him and changed nothing about himself, did not adjust for being observed, because this was one of the things about Ira Yates that she had loved almost immediately. He was the same person watched or unwatched, known or unknown, which was rarer than it should be. He came and sat beside her. The sun was going down behind the mountains. The Sweetwater was audible in the distance, low in the August heat but present, always present. "Good day?" she asked. "The fence on the north quarter held," he said. "Patience threw a shoe. Ford is coming Thursday to look at the chestnut filly. That is a report, not a day." He looked at her. The look he had when she said something that pleased him, which she identified by the slight shift at the corner of his mouth and the quality of attention in his eyes. "It was a good day," he said. "Most days are." "Most days are," she agreed. They were quiet for a moment, the quiet they had developed over 9 years of marriage, the kind that is full rather than empty, that holds everything between two people rather than asking them to fill it with sound. "I had a letter today," Ira said. She looked at him. He reached into his shirt pocket and took it out and held it toward her, nothing secret in the gesture, nothing hidden, just here. She took it. It was from Samuel Jersh, the clerk from Lawrence, Kansas. the man who had sent the original letter 6 years ago, who had testified in the courthouse proceeding. A short note, neatly written in his careful ledger hand. He said he had a son now, born the previous spring. He said the legal proceedings from the Pemberton case had been fully concluded that winter, all accounts settled and all records corrected. He said he hoped Ira and his family were well. He said he wanted to say again that he was sorry for his part in the years of silence and that he was glad the record reflected the truth. Belle read it twice, folded it along its creases, handed it back. "He has a son," she said. "He does." "That is good." "Yes." Ira tucked the letter back into his pocket in the easy way of a man who has nothing to hide from anyone. "I thought I would write back, tell him we are well, that Thomas is 9 and Ellie is 4, and that the ranch is doing well and the fence on the north quarter held." "That is a report," she said, and he did smile then fully. "I will think of something to add," he said. "You could tell him about the letter," she said. "The first one, what it was like to receive it, what we did with it." He considered this. "I think he knows what it was like to receive it. He wrote it." "Not that letter," she said quietly. "The one we burned." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains in the failing light. "I could do that," he said finally. "Yes, I think he would understand." She reached over and covered his hand with hers on the arm of the chair between them, the gesture she had made 100 times, 1,000 times, and every time with the same simplicity of meaning. "I am here, this is us, we are in this together." "Ira," she said, "Belle, are you happy?" It was not a trivial question, and she did not ask trivial questions, and he received it accordingly, taking a genuine moment to answer it honestly rather than automatically. "Yes," he said. "Not the way I did not know I could be when I was carrying things I could not name, but yes." He turned his hand under hers so they were holding hands on the chair arm, as they had on the train home from Kansas, as they had at the Sweetwater after the letter burned, as they had in the mercantile when she grabbed his arm and spun him around and made him face the thing he had been carrying. "You are the reason for most of it." "Only most," she said. "The fence holding accounts for a small percentage." She laughed, and he laughed with her, and the sound of it went out into the August evening over the Wyoming hills and the Sweetwater River and the land they had built their life on, and it was the sound of something fully earned. The autumn of 1888 settled into the rhythm that all their autumns had, the particular cadence of frontier life in a Wyoming that was changing around them even as the essential patterns held. The railroad was bringing more settlers. The territory itself was moving toward statehood, which people discussed with varying degrees of enthusiasm, depending on their relationship to the current arrangement. The land that had been wilderness when Thomas Walker first claimed his 40 acres was filling in, road by road and building by building, with the incremental transformation of a place becoming something different from what it had been. Ira watched this with the complicated feelings of someone who had arrived when things were rawer and had built specifically into that rawness, the way certain plants root better in difficult soil. He was not nostalgic exactly. He was too practical for pure nostalgia, but he was attentive to the changes in a way that made him thoughtful in those evening conversations with Belle that had become the most sustaining part of his daily life. They talked about the children's futures in this changing West. Thomas Jr. had declared recently his intention to become an engineer, which was at once entirely surprising and completely in keeping with the boy who had taught himself to read a surveying tool at 8. Ira had listened to this declaration with the seriousness it deserved, which meant he had asked detailed questions about what Thomas meant by engineer, what kind, where he imagined studying, whether this was a passing interest or a considered one. Thomas had been gratifyingly prepared for these questions, which told Ira everything he needed to know about the difference between a passing enthusiasm and an actual direction. Belle had spoken to Thomas about it separately, about the practicalities, about how this would work, and had come away with the assessment that the boy was serious and should be supported in being serious. She and Ira discussed this in the way they discussed everything that mattered, thoroughly, honestly from both of their perspectives, arriving at a shared position that incorporated both views. "He should go east," Ira said. "When he is ready. There are schools that can teach him what he needs. He is 9, Belle said. So we have time to plan. We also have time for him to change his mind. He will change his mind approximately 17 times, Ira said. But when he comes back around to engineering, we will be ready. This was Ira's particular form of parental faith, the belief not that his children would stay fixed, but that they would find their way to the true thing, and his job was to have the support ready when they arrived. Ellie at 4 was already showing what Belle privately thought of as an aptitude for horses that rivaled even Ford's, which Ford had confirmed with a seriousness that suggested he was not simply being kind about a small child. She could read the animals in a way that was not yet skilled but was inherently perceptive, and Ford and June had already started, informally, including her in their work when she was brought to visit, with the careful approach of people introducing someone to a world they think will be important to her. Belle thought about Ellie sometimes with a specific quality of attention that she recognized as paying close watch to someone who is going to need space to be themselves. Ellie was not going to be a quiet person, or a deferential one, or a person who fit easily into the shapes that were still, in 1888, more readily available to girls than to women. Belle thought about what the world would look like by the time Ellie was grown, whether it would be larger or different in the ways that mattered, and she thought about what she could give her daughter now that would serve her in that larger world. Courage, she thought, honesty, the expectation that her own perceptions are valid, the knowledge that silence is a choice and not an obligation. She told Ellie these things in the ways that are available when a child is 4. In stories, in how she handled situations, in the simple daily example of being a woman who said what she meant and meant what she said and did not apologize for either. On a Sunday afternoon in October, with the cottonwoods gold again along the Sweetwater and the mountains sharp and clear in the autumn air, the whole of the Yates family gathered at the main ranch as they did several times a year, all the brothers and their families, and the gathering had the particular quality of something that had accumulated over a decade of practice, comfortable and loud, and layered with the history of people who know each other in the specific way that only family and long years can build. Calhoun's stepson, who was now 18 and had taken to calling himself a Yates in everything except the legal formality, was talking cattle with Remington with a competence that made Calhoun, across the yard, look privately satisfied. Holt and Edith were having an argument about something that, from the quality of their expressions, was somewhere between genuinely contested and performatively dramatic, their natural mode. Ford and June were by the corral, talking horses with the intense focused quiet of people who can have a full conversation while watching an animal move. Remington and Lucy's daughter, 3 years old, was being held by Thomas Jr., as if she were an extremely delicate and slightly suspicious package, which made Belle laugh from across the yard. Ellie was with Calhoun's wife Margaret, who had a gift for children that was patient and warm and had nothing to prove, the best kind. They were looking at something in the garden, some particular plant that Margaret was explaining with the seriousness she gave to everything she actually cared about. Thomas Walker was sitting in a chair that had been brought out for him to the yard, in the sun, because the October sun was warm and his joints were better for it. He was watching all of it with the expression he had developed in his retirement from hard labor, which was the expression of a man who has done the difficult work of his life and is now granted the secondary pleasure of watching what came of it. Ira was beside Belle. He was almost always beside Belle. This was not an accident or a habit. It was a continuous choice, made daily and renewed daily, the choice to be present where it mattered. "Look at this," Belle said, not directing it at anything specific, gesturing slightly at the whole of the yard and the people in it. "Look at what the brothers built." "What you helped build," Ira said. "We," she said, "all of us." He looked at the yard. At his brothers in all their variousness, Calhoun steady as stone, Holt loud and alive, Remington and Lucy warm and solid, Ford and June burning with the particular quiet intensity of people who have found their thing. He looked at the children moving between the adults. He looked at Thomas Walker in his chair in the sun. He looked at Belle. "Yes," he said, "all of us." She reached up and smoothed the collar of his jacket, a small domestic gesture, the kind that only happens between people who have been in each other's daily lives long enough. That touch is unremarkable, and therefore the most real kind. He caught her hand when she lowered it and held it, and she looked up at him with those dark eyes that had been reading him since the summer of 1878, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already present in the afternoon, and the people around them, and the years behind them, and the years still ahead. Later, when supper was done, and the children were starting to wear down, and the conversations had gone soft with the particular warmth of a good day reaching its close, Ira and Belle walked down to the river together because they often did, because the Sweetwater had become their river in the way that places become yours, when enough of your life's significant moments have occurred in their vicinity. The water was low, as it always was in October, and it ran silver and quiet between the banks with the cottonwoods above it half undressed of their gold leaves. The evening star was up, bright and early in the pale sky, and the first bite of the coming cold was in the air, gentle still but present. They stood at the edge of the water and Belle leaned against Ira, and he held her the way he always held her, with the ease of long practice and the attentiveness of genuine choice, and they looked at the river for a while. "I burned a letter here once," Ira said. "I remember," she said. "I was there." "I know you were." He was quiet for a moment. "I think about it sometimes, not with regret, more like gratitude that we came through it to here." "We did not come through it," she said gently. "We are still in it. The coming through is the whole thing, Ira." Every day, he thought about this. "That is a more demanding view than I had originally signed up for," he said. "You signed up in October of 1879 in a small church in Dusty Creek," she said. "You knew what you were getting into." "I knew some of it," he said. "I did not know about the chess." "The chess? Your father is a devastating chess player, and you failed to disclose this before I agreed to share a household with him." She laughed, and the sound of it went out over the river, and the cottonwoods received it and gave it back slightly. "I will add it to the ledger of things I owe you." "You owe me nothing," he said, and there was no humor in it now, just the plain weight of what he meant. "You never did. Everything between us has been exact." She turned in his arms to face him, which she did not do dramatically, but simply, naturally, the way you turn toward someone you have been turning toward for a long time. In the failing light, he looked the same and different as he had at 26, same eyes and same jaw and same quality of attention, but layered with everything that had come since. Kansas resolved, and the letter ash, and the brothers married, and the children real, and the years of daily built trust that was the actual substance of the life they had made. "Ira," she said. "Belle," he said, and the way he said her name was the way he had said it since the beginning precisely, as if it were a word that meant more than it looked like from the outside. She kissed him there by the Sweetwater River in the October evening, and he kissed her back with everything that was 10 years of them, the whole accumulation of it, nothing secret and nothing hidden and everything exactly as it was. They walked back up to the lights of the main ranch where their children were, where the brothers were, where Thomas Walker was probably reorganizing his chess strategy for the next morning's game, where supper had been eaten and the fire was being built up against the coming cold, and someone, probably Holt, was telling a story that was too loud for the size of the room. They walked back into the warmth and the noise of it all, and they were home. Wyoming became a state in 1890. Thomas Jr. at 11 attended the celebration in Dusty Creek with Ira and Belle, and came home talking about politics and the law with an intensity that had slightly revised his engineering ambitions in the direction of engineering and the law, which Ira received with the serenity of a man who had been paying attention. Ellie at 6 had begun riding seriously, under Ford and June's careful instruction, and was developing the posture and the hand of someone who is genuinely talented, rather than merely enthusiastic. Ford had told Ira privately that the girl had something rare, and that if she was allowed to develop it she would be exceptional. Ira had thanked him and then gone home and told Belle, who had nodded with the expression of someone whose private assessment has been externally confirmed. Holt's drinking, in the years since the worst of it, had receded to a manageable level, though it was never entirely absent, and the family had made a peace with it that was not the peace of acceptance but the peace of ongoing management combined with love. Edith handled it with the practicality of a woman who had married with full information and who was not interested in pretending about things that were real. Their children were well and loved, and the household was, on balance, a good one. Thomas Walker's health improved slightly in the years after he moved in with Ira and Belle, which the doctor attributed to being warm and regularly fed and having people around him, which were the things that keep older people well. He continued to play chess with Ira with undiminished ferocity. He continued to tell Thomas Jr. stories about the early Wyoming Territory that Thomas Jr. listened to with the historical interest of a future engineer lawyer, who understood that where things came from mattered. Belle, at 34, found herself thinking about the next chapter of things with the particular quality of a person who has completed one substantial project and is beginning to sense the shape of the next. The kitchen garden had grown into something that produced enough to contribute meaningfully to the family's provisions and to trade and occasionally to gift, and she had been asked twice by women in the settlement for advice on their own gardens, which had led to an informal and enjoyable consultancy that she thought could become more organized if she wanted it to. She was also, she had recently discovered, expecting their third child. This one she told Ira on an evening in November by the fire rather than at breakfast, because the mornings had been somewhat challenging and evenings were better. He received the news with the same pattern as always, the stillness, the undisguised happiness, the immediate practical concern, and then something additional this time. He looked at her with a particular expression and said, "Three, she confirmed. "We are doing this again. We are doing this again." "Good," he said, with the finality of a man making a decision he is pleased to have made. And she thought that was so entirely Ira, that good, that simple and complete and entirely genuine response. Their third child was born in July of 1891, another boy, sturdy and loud and immediately opinionated about everything within his experience. They named him Samuel, not after Samuel Jersh, not exactly, but not entirely not after him either. It was a name that acknowledged something without making a speech about it, which was very much in keeping with how Ira handled the past. Thomas Jr., who was 12, regarded his new brother with the critical eye of an eldest child and declared him acceptable. Ellie at 7 regarded him with the practical assessment of someone who has observed a great many young animals and is applying the same framework: small, noisy, limited in current capability, probable improvement with time. She was not wrong. Calhoun, when he came to see the new baby and found his family assembled in the Walker Yates cabin, with the afternoon light coming in, and 3 children distributed around the room at various points of activity, and Thomas Walker asleep in his chair and Ira and Belle sitting together with the infant between them, stood in the doorway for a moment, and looked at all of it with the expression he had for things that were conclusively good. "You have done well," he said to both of them, which was not something he said often, which was why it landed with full weight when he said it. "We all have," Ira said. Calhoun looked at his brother, the second eldest, the one who had come back from Kansas with something in his eyes that none of them had been able to name, who had fixed a woman's pump and fallen in love and been secretive and been confronted and been forgiven and been married and been a father and been, over all the years, himself more completely and more honestly than he had arrived at the ranch being. He nodded. "Yes," Calhoun said, "we all have." The Sweetwater River ran its course through the autumn of 1891 as it ran through every autumn, low and silver in the Wyoming light, patient and persistent, the way rivers are, the way some things are. The cottonwoods along its banks went gold and then went bare, and then in the spring that would come, would go green again, as they always did, as the world does when it has good reason to. And on an evening in the October that followed, when the first frost had touched the grass, and the mountains were beginning to put on their winter white, and the children were in bed, and Thomas Walker was asleep with a book across his lap, and the fire was built up against the cold, Ira Yates sat across from his wife at the kitchen table, and they played chess, which was a game they had been playing together since Thomas Sr. had taught them both one Sunday afternoon 2 years ago, and which had become another of the daily rituals that made up the texture of their shared life. Belle took his queen in a move that she had been setting up for the last 6 turns and looked at him across the board with the expression of a woman who is not surprised by her own success but is enjoying it thoroughly. "You saw that coming," Ira said. "3 turns ago," she said, "and you said nothing. You did not ask." He looked at the board, assessed the remaining position with the practical intelligence of a man who knows when something is conclusive, and tipped his king over. "Your father taught you this," he said. "He taught me everything about chess," she said. "The things I know about you I figured out myself." He looked up at her, and the firelight was between them, and the night was outside, and the children were sleeping, and the house was warm, and the Sweetwater was running somewhere beyond the dark, and there was nothing hidden between them, and nothing owed, and nothing left unresolved. "What did you figure out?" he said. "That you were worth the river," she said. He reached across the chess board and took her hand, careful of the pieces, and held it. "So were you," he said. "Belle, so were you." And outside the frost lay quiet on the Wyoming ground, and the stars came out, every one of them, over the land they had made their own.